Just like narcissistic abuse, spiritual abuse is very ambient. And because it's so difficult to identify, I'm going to mention some of the most common ways you can tell if you've been spiritually abused, or if you suspect that you may be enmeshed in a spiritually abusive system. The reason why spiritual abuse hurts so much is because it inflicts a deep wound at the very core of our being. Something sacred is distorted and used as a tool for manipulation and control. Spiritual abuse is really dangerous because it can so severely damage a person that they may question the purpose of their life and their value as a human being. It may even lead to thoughts of suicide because the abuse has made them feel that God has abandoned them. They may never want to have anything to do with God, religion, or spirituality again after experiencing spiritual abuse. And spiritually abused people will continue carrying a tremendous sense of guilt, fear, and shame even after they have left a particular organization. People who have been spiritually abused have been manipulated and their vulnerabilities exploited. The abuse has altered their definition of God, and they question and are confused about their relationship with God. Even years after exiting a spiritually abusive system, most people may not be able to identify it. It's very stealth, and nobody talks about their experiences because they've been programmed to keep quiet, not to talk about it, because it feels like they are betraying God or their family or the church. In a spiritually abusive organization, the most important thing is how things appear. The impression that you, your family, or your children are making. In abusive systems, all that matters is the reputation and appearance of order within the organization. Your ability to unquestionably obey authority is paramount. And there are many unspoken rules. And there is a rule of silence, which means you're not allowed to talk about problems. So legitimate concerns are swept under the carpet with the use of shame. You cannot voice any abuses in an abusive system, and silence conveniently allows abuse to continue. And the real victim is made to be at fault for having questions or even pointing out that there is a problem. You can literally be walking out of a spiritual gathering, but you're feeling physically and psychologically exhausted, not refreshed or inspired. Victims of spiritual abuse feel very alone and like they're crazy because of the pressure of not being able to talk about their reality. Spiritual abuse occurs when a leader or someone perceived as an authority actually puts themselves or the organization or their rules in place of God. They claim to have special insights and use their position of authority to coerce, spiritually bully, and manipulate people. And victims of spiritual abuse have a very distorted self-identity, and they see themselves in a really negative way because it's a shame-based identity, and shame is their biggest motivator of behavior. They have difficulty with feeling good about themselves because the indoctrination convinced them that they are bad and never good enough. So they may be chronic people pleasers and tend to be overly responsible. They will have issues with personal boundaries because all their boundaries have been violated. People within an organization that is spiritually abusive will either be over-involved in other people's businesses, so there'll be a lot of gossiping, browbeating, cliques forming within the group that separate those who are more spiritual than those who aren't. Or they'll be at the other extreme and be under-involved and neglect important yet practical issues that need to be addressed. Information will be controlled, so certain people know certain things, while the rest will not be privileged to that information. So there's a lot of information control and secrecy. Shame-driven indoctrination forces them into submission. They'll be driven with a fear of disappointing God because it's based on obeying authority, rules, which they've been programmed to believe represent God. So if they step out of line, God will be disappointed, will punish them, or withdraw his love. So basically the system, the rules, the beliefs have taken the place of God in their mind. If they disobey authority, they will be shamed or their privileges within the organisation degraded. It's a very predictable method of control. Another sign of spiritual abuse is when you're expected to prove how spiritual you are. You have to live up to some sort of spiritual standard, something you need to perform, and your performance is rewarded. So this could be how many times you've prayed, attended church, how many times you've repeated some ritual, and there's an undercurrent of competition and definitely hierarchy. Another example of this is when parents use their children as objects of gratification, as examples of how spiritual the parents are or the family is. They set really harsh standards and use threats to intimidate that child to perform, so they can maintain the impression that their family is making in the church. And walking into a spiritually abusive environment, you feel the participants watching you, comparing you, judging, measuring, and criticizing you. It's how they control your behavior and keep you in check, so you're obedient and so you don't bring any possible disrepute to the organization. So it's more about your performance and the appearance. So if you start behaving in a way that's not approved, or perhaps you're interested in a subject that they deem as not being spiritual, you'll be given the cold shoulder. So again, it's not about helping you or inspiring a spiritual connection, but it's all about maintaining a good impression of the religion. An extreme form of this behavior is shunning and ostracizing. Basically, they will withhold love, support, validation until you do it their way. Just like narcissistic abuse, their love and support is based on meeting certain conditions. And spiritual abuse is based on a reward system. You need to earn God's love. You have to prove yourself. You can't just be, you have to do. And every time you do, the benchmark seems to change or get higher. So people who have or who are spiritually abused feel tired, exhausted, ashamed, fearful and guilty. There seems to be impossible standards to meet. No matter how good they are, it's never quite good enough. They need to try harder to prove their worth, and if they stop doing, they'll feel worthless and undeserving of God's love. So it's easy to recognize the similarities between a narcissistic relationship and spiritual abuse. And Christ's messages are distorted, and victims of abuse feel heavy and burdened, as opposed to what the Spirit of Christ is meant to do, and that is to help us lift the oppressive weights, empower us, give us a sense of freedom in Christ, right? There's a lot of talk about freedom, but you'll feel imprisoned and restricted. So there's the illusion of freedom and that you have choices, but your choices are within a strict limit they set. And if you step out of that range, there'll be consequences, such as withdrawal of privileges within the church, withholding of attention, you're going to be excluded from certain activities, you may be ignored, you might observe a lot of sullen behavior. There's a lot of indirect communication to let you know you've displeased God Himself. It could be really minute things like wearing makeup, doing your hair a certain way, maybe your car is too flash, or you expressed interest in something that's not supported by the church. So, these organisations have unspoken rules, and you usually find out about what those rules are when you overstep their invisible lines. And you get the impression that it's not really about the behaviour, it's about controlling you. The strict discipline may also feel more directed at you as a person rather than the behaviour. And the most obvious signs are frequent feelings of emptiness, disconnection, oppression, and confusion despite doing all the right things. Spiritually abused people often unknowingly may be experiencing cognitive dissonance, hiding a lot of psychological distress behind a pleasant smile, because they're holding several contradictory beliefs. You hear them preaching all these great things, but you witness prevalent hypocrisy and double standards. We endlessly repeat and hear it repeated from the podium, God is love. But yet we behave in very unloving ways towards people who don't share our beliefs. And another really sad example is when you've been sitting in these organisations for years and you know these people inside out. So you know that certain people are in extremely abusive situations, like domestic violence, perhaps one of the spouses is a violent alcoholic, But we all sit there, smile, walk on eggshells, and pretend none of this is going on, and God will deal with it. Or so the pastor keeps telling us for the past 10 years. So spiritualizing abuse is another common coping method within these systems. And another issue is that you are discouraged for seeking outside help because everything remains closed within the organisation, but yet they are not dealing with known cases of abuse. So this creates such an internal conflict mentally, emotionally and psychologically that many people do struggle with mental health challenges. And for those of us who long to be authentic, this crazy-making, disingenuous environment is like being in a slow psychological pressure cooker. They keep repeating we have the truth, but we can't even confront the truth of what's going on. So when we have been indoctrinated to believe that this toxic environment is spirituality, that kind of deception becomes very dangerous. And the terms false prophet and false light come to mind. And these kind of environments are magnetizing for pathological narcissists, psychopaths, and other perpetrators of covert abuse because they are never confronted. They use religion and spirituality to further control, manipulate, justify their righteousness, and continue their holier-than-thou attitude and enforce their abusive agenda. This system ensures that they will never be held accountable because all abuse is spiritualized and the real victims continue to suffer in silence and oppression. And the saddest part is that victims of spiritual abuse will have difficulty admitting that they have been abused because the organization keeps telling them that they are the problem for noticing that there is a problem. They may feel like they are betraying the organization or God by exposing the truth of what they've experienced. We may have spent years being told what to think, but not how to think. So we start believing we are helpless. And this is a formula that's called learned helplessness. And it's all about control. It's very subtle, but can be very wounding to a recipient. People who have been spiritually abused have a very distorted view of God because they've been made to believe that God is vindictive, that God's mood is dependent on their behavior, that God is very demanding, and we must work hard to keep God happy. And you can see how much fear is in this indoctrination. And nobody wants to admit that something like this happened to them. So most people don't talk about it because it makes them feel ashamed and humiliated. Just like with narcissistic abuse, you feel stupid for being so naive, and it's difficult to forgive yourself, let alone talk about it publicly. And I know this was definitely the case for me. So if you can relate to what I've described, it's just like narcissistic abuse. You feel crazy until you understand. It's about control, not spirituality. It's using the concept of God and spirituality to coerce you. And anybody or any organization claiming to represent God that uses guilt, shame, or fear is violating your spiritual boundaries. If an external source is tampering with your intuition, setting harsh rules about how you have to earn your right to that connection, that is abusive. Let's remember that spirituality is a personal connection with the divine. If anyone is implying that you are worthless or not good enough, they obviously need you to drop down into worthlessness so they can feel above you to be able to control you. Don't ever believe this. You have inherent goodness within you. You were made in the image of the Creator. Don't ever allow anybody or any belief system to make you doubt your absolute worthiness. Your heart is your direct connection to God's source. Everything else is just a secondary source that you have the right to discern. Our life is a demonstration of what we believe. Truth is invitational. We intuitively are drawn toward what's good or what's God. And you cannot force a person or threaten them to behave a certain way because that's tyranny and it's tampering with their free will. And that's why it's always important to be discerning, even with spirituality. And I think you'll agree that your chosen spiritual practice should enhance your life experience. It should bring you more freedom, more joy, more peace, and more love toward yourself and toward others. And I just want to leave you with one thought. Wherever you are on this journey and this very delicate subject of spirituality or religion, I just want you to remember you are loved and you have always been loved. Just the fact that you are alive means you are worthy, deserving, and a precious contributor to bringing more love and light into this world.